Hi, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our class this morning here at Newport News Church of Christ. It's a privilege and honor to be here among you, and we pray your day is going well. As we wish you were here with us this morning, and it's hopefully in due time we'll all be back together soon. We've been continuing our study on Genesis, the life of Abraham, for seems like 9 months now. And fittingly, it's about the topic of the birth of Isaac. So if we're going to move on to chapter 21 this morning and talk about that birth. So, Isaac. If you would, turn to Genesis chapter 21 and you can be able to follow with us. It is the birth of Isaac. I guess there's no anticipated birth like this except for maybe Christ himself. And that was kind of a short notice. But Christ's birth was probably anticipated from the fall in the garden. So that's thousands and thousands of years that were out there for us to consider the birth of Christ. But we've been talking about the birth of Isaac now for 25 years with Abraham's life and Sarah's. Abraham turning 100, Sarah turning 90. We have a promise that started in Genesis 12 that he would be a great nation, and through his seed, many countries will flourish. But again, he fell on his face and laughed in chapter 17 and verse 17. And here he's thinking that I'm 75 years old, and where do I come in having a child at my age, and especially Sarah being 90. But during this visit, he got three strangers. And this is when I think Sarah is the first understanding that she is going to get pregnant at 90 years old. She overheard these angels and the Lord talking with Abraham at this point in time. And he's saying that you're going to have a child, Abraham, like I promised you 25 years ago. Just don't lose your faith. And when Sarah heard that, she laughed as well. So we have Abraham laughing, we have Sarah laughing. And it comes to fruition. The next year, here we are, the birth of Isaac. Chapter 21, and the Lord visited Sarah and said, the Lord did unto all as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, and at the set of the time which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. You can see here the God's intervention. The promises that were made were being fulfilled. This is God's plan, not Abraham's. Excuse me. He makes sure of this by confirming his message, not only to Abraham several times, to Sarah, but also sending two angels and the Lord down to confirm it. 3 heavenly visitors to make sure that this promise is being taken. To reassure them. Don't we need reassurance? It seems like we kind of waver on and off on lots of times. And the importance of reassurance we can find in God's word, but having 3 heavenly beings come down to personally reassure you is comforting to both Abraham and maybe not to Sarah at that time, but it is now. Because their whole goal was to have a child and to fulfill the promise that was given to her, and the hopelessness she must have felt in her infertility. So these are all God's intervention here and how faithful the Lord is. The Lord visited her and provided Sarah a child like he said he would. We talked about how old each one of them was. Abraham was 100, 90 for Sarah. And now we're talking about, now what am I going to do with Ishmael here? Can you imagine what Ishmael must have been going through during this time, knowing that he wasn't the chosen one? Or if he was even told? Because typically in this culture, the eldest get the major portion of the inheritance. And here's Ishmael, probably what, 13, 14 years old by now? Doesn't always work out that way. I don't always get what I want. So this is God's provisions. You can remember this as Jacob and Esau and how that happened with that family. There's a lot of turmoil in this family about promises made down the line, because now you see that Jacob and Esau represents the Gentile and Jewish nation. That's how Jacob was holding on to the heel of Esau coming out of the womb. And during this time of waiting, God has always been faithful. But Abraham and Sarah may not have taken it as seriously as God wanted them to. It probably wasn't until she felt that first kick in her womb, feeling that that's really going to happen. So it's the choices that he made during this time of 25 years of waiting. We get impatient. The problems that we occur, that we have to do it, want it now, all the time, it doesn't really help us. We got to remember that we're on God's time frame. Whenever he wants things to happen, it's not when we want them to happen. Because Job realized that in Job 42. And he says, Job answered the Lord and says, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Job understood that eventually. But when you talk about God's time frame, Mike and I talk about that on occasion. I don't think we can comprehend God's meaning of time. It has no significance to him. He creates a world. He probably could have done it in 2 minutes, but he took 6 days to rest on the seventh. Did he need rest? No. Creating a universe in several days is unfathomable. And what it means to us, timeline-wise, when we get to heaven, that will be the only time we can appreciate what time actually doesn't matter anymore. Because I'm looking at a clock right now, because I have 45 minutes to do this lesson. I am bound by those guidelines. There's reasons for that. But can you imagine being in a place where you don't have to have an alarm clock, or you don't have to be a certain place at a certain time, or obligating yourself to be there? It doesn't matter. It'll be endless. So God's thinking that in his time frame, he picked the perfect time for Isaac to be born. It wasn't when Abraham wanted it. It wasn't when Sarah wanted it. It's when God wanted it. Abraham had to wait, proving themselves to be faithful. Maybe it took them 25 years to prove that. Waiting for an answered prayer. Have you ever prayed for something many times and not really think that you got an answer yet? It happens. That's why when you pray, you always think that I want the wisdom that I need to see the answer to your prayer, even if it's waiting. Give me patience to wait. How much prayer did go off to Abraham and Sarah asking for a child that was being promised to them, to deliver it to them probably every day? Waiting 25 years for a blessing, then receiving that blessing, the joy that must have been in that family. And here we are in his time frame. We need to be able to prove ourselves to be faithful, trusting God's provisions. And when things don't happen in our timeline, how do we respond to that? Do we allow circumstances to fill us with doubt and uncertainty? Just saying, well, God's not listening. He doesn't hear what I need. We do that often. So we sit there and we think of ourselves, I need to ride this out. I need to be like Abraham. I need to be like Sarah. I need to fill my life with faith and understanding and patience, waiting for this to happen, if it be in God's will. We have the same thing that they were doing. We have to wait for Jesus' return. Here we are, a Christian, and some of us have been Christian longer than others. Some have obeyed the gospel early in an age. Some may have not. Some may wait until they're older. Their life as a Christian could be months, years, or days. But it says here that when I obeyed the gospel, and I obeyed probably 30 some years ago, I didn't have an idea when Jesus was going to come back. But now I prepared myself for his return. If it happened that next day, I was ready. But it seems like the longer we wait, we have choices that we make too. Can we become impatient and say, Jesus is never coming, just like the church at Thessalonica? They were kind of worried and saying, what's going to happen? This thing's not happening now. Why is not Christ coming back? I obeyed the gospel. Things are bad here. Why can't he come and save us from all of this? Things are bad now. Why can't he come and save us from all of this? It's in the last days that Jesus comes, and it talks about the last days in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. And it's almost poetic the way this book starts. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken up to us by his Son. So we know that in the last days Christ is coming. Those last days are here because his Son has spoken to all of us in that first century. We are in the last days. Again, God's time frame. The last days to us seem like a week, maybe a few days. But now it's been 2,000 years are considered the last days to God. The patience that he has with us living in these last days, waiting for us to be faithful, proving ourselves to be faithful. Because these last days are the ones we have right now, and we have to be able to live in it. Those are the words, we have to be in the world, but not of the world. There's no choice in this. We need to understand that God is faithful to his promises. And that's what brings us through all of our difficulties. It could have been doubt for Abraham and Sarah for 25 years. Because when we look back at Genesis 17, we understand that God gave Abraham a promise of Isaac. But Sarah finds out in chapter 18. Kind of makes you wonder if Abraham was so doubtful that he didn't even bother telling his wife until she overheard it when the angels came. But nevertheless, it's here. So we have Abraham. Why is he giving Abraham this child at this point? And we have his almost his resume here. There's a lot of things here that we can go through. In Genesis chapter 11, you can see what his faith process becomes and how it strengthens over time. He leaves his home with his nephew Lot to come to Canaan. That's the first big sign of faith that most of us need to have too, that we need to leave our past behind and live a life of Christianity. That's probably hardest one of all, because we like to keep, like Lot had, is 1 foot towards Sodom, or pitched his tent towards Sodom. We like to keep things close. This was a total departure. He left to come to Haran and then eventually to Canaan. He receives God's call, but he does go to Egypt because of a famine. He builds altars in Haran as well. There's a sign of faith of his worship to God now. He rescued him from the Chaldeans, gave him a promise. Genesis chapter 13, he returns to Canaan. from Egypt. He's enriched at this point. He has many cattle, many sheep, many camels, many things that are available to him now. And then also a part of this is Hagar, a bondswoman that came to minister to Sarah. And then because of the problems with the herdsmen in the lands of Canaan, they agree amicably to separate from Lot. He takes the high road. He gives Lot the first choice. He goes off and does what Lot wants to do, while Abraham stays where he is in Canaan. Genesis 14, while Lot had pitched his tent towards Sodom, he ends up in Sodom, and then the king of Sodom then captives and holds him. And then again, Abraham, they had to rescue him, and also receives Melchizedek's blessing. Genesis 15. Again, this is several years later, the covenant renewed after 24 years. Genesis 17, it's renewed again. God gives Abraham requirements that you need to have this circumcision. He does his whole family. He gives him the promise in the name of Isaac, which his son's going to be named. And he builds another altar in Canaan. Genesis 18. He intercedes for the righteous in Sodom and then rescues Lot again. There's 2 points in history that are intriguing to me. One is Sodom and Gomorrah, and the other is the destruction through the flood. In both of these time frames, you can read that there's not a righteous person left alive. Let me rephrase that. There wasn't found a righteous person. In the days of Noah, 8 souls out of millions. 8 souls. In the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, couldn't find 5. Once, we're not even saying that Lot was righteous at this point. It's saying that he was giving Abraham the benefit of the doubt by allowing him to pull Lot out before he destroyed that city. And then at that point on, you never hear another word from Lot. He kind of disappears into the history. Not mentioned like Abraham. He could have. There was an opportunity there for him to exceed just like Abraham did. With Genesis chapter 21, the baby comes, and that's what we're reading today. Circumcised on the 8th day, builds an altar. Genesis 22, offering Isaac up as a sacrifice. How difficult that must have been. A young man being asked of God to go out and to offer him as a sacrifice. And then when you look at the Gospels, you have Jesus comparing the first century Jews to Abraham's behavior, how their behavior was not like Abraham's. And Paul does the same thing in Romans chapter 4. If you're going to use your father Abraham as an example of faith and strength, then you have to live a life like what Abraham did. They weren't doing that. Look at the reaction that those people that had received the gospel in Acts chapter 7 through Stephen's sermon, and how he used Abraham as another example there. It didn't end well for Stephen. They took it personally that they were not living the life Abraham led. Even though Jesus pointed it out, even though Stephen pointed it out, and Paul points it out as well. Galatians chapter 3, linking God's promise to Abraham's seed to New Testament Christianity. That's remarkable. That something that happened 6,000 to 7,000 years ago still applies today, that promise is fulfilled, that everyone that obeys the gospel of Jesus Christ, that plan of salvation, that faith system that's in place, is heir to Abraham's seed and heir to that promise that was given to him thousands of years ago. Hebrews, example to those wanting to return to Judaism. Faith has to be strong. He never went back to the city of Ur, where he came from. not like Lot. We have an example of Lot, how he digressed, but Abraham remained strong. He never looked back. Lot's wife looked back. Abraham never looked back. In Christianity, you always have to have that faith and strength of looking forward. And these are the attributes that he instills in Isaac throughout his life. As a father to a parent, as a child, you have to instill that kind of confidence in God. Because otherwise, you're going to have examples of people that are going to want to return back to their way that things were. No faith there. James chapter 2 calls Abraham a friend of God. And that's in Abraham's summary. And when you compare that and you read all that and it says, now I've been a Christian for 30 years. What is my faith resume? What have I done that could warrant something like this? When God opens up my book at the day of judgment, am I going to see paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of faithful behavior, strength, courage under fire, willingness to overcome obstacles, showing people through my light that there is hope in God, hope in Christ? Or is it going to be like Lot's story, that you gave up, you pitched your tent, you couldn't wait for me? And they're going to explain that to me in excruciating detail on every single mistake that I made in my faith from day one. And that's what's going to trouble me probably throughout of eternity, that I had opportunities to fix a problem and never did. And I got to keep that in mind, that my faith and our faith has to be strong enough to endure difficult times. We have to see the big picture. It doesn't get easier for Isaac later on. He does lead a faithful life just like his father. Back to Genesis 21, verses 6 and 7. We have an event here where we see Sarah's reaction to her son being born. Genesis 21, verses 6 and 7. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that here will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah would have given children suck? For I have borne him a son of his old age. It's only a few words in these passages mentioned about her reaction. And it's kind of subtle. And I don't know if you have footnotes or references there in your Bible. When you look at verse 6, it talks about two references here. It goes back to Isaiah 54, and it talks about the joy that she has at this time in her life. And it actually goes back to Luke chapter 1 at the birth or the conception and joy that Elizabeth felt when John was in her womb, and how the family came all together and they were rejoicing with nieces and nephews and husbands and wives, all came together to embrace this moment with Elizabeth, that she was pregnant and she was going to have a child named John. The joy that family felt at that time. You can see the same kind of joy here, but even though it's so small of a reference, the reference is there that she had exceedingly joy being 90 years old and now having a child that has been promised to her. Isaac would be a constant reminder to us and to her. You remember, she laughed, and it was almost a mocking laugh. Jealous. But you look through this, rejoicing becomes short-lived. But her faith is in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 13. It says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. In Hebrews 11:11, Sarah is mentioned in that chapter of the faith. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Matthew 19, verse 26, with God, all things are possible. And you can compare this, and we mentioned it a little bit earlier, that there was no birth more anticipated than Isaac, but other than Christ. And Mary's reaction when she found out that her virgin conception and then birth, it says, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. Believing spirit through knowing what's going to be said. Excuse me. His promises are guaranteed. Even though Sarah experienced long nights of disappointment, 25 years of disappointment, despair, loneliness, jealousy, the moment come and pain, but joy came in the morning. Even though it was a child that comes with pain, it brought her joy. This is Sarah rejoicing at 90 years old, giving birth. How miraculous is that? Giving, strengthened by angels to help her get through this difficult time of childbearing. It's not on our schedule. It's on his. Virgin conception is not any more miraculous that we have here. The giving Sarah strength to receive a child at 90 years old. That same thing could have happened to Naomi when we talked about Naomi and Ruth. God could have given her a child. Obed could have been hers. But we talk about here is the more miraculous is that birth of Christ through Mary as a virgin. Never ever happened before and never ever will. One time only. And then when you talk about rejoicing, when you look at Luke chapter 10 and verse 20, Jesus is saying, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. When does that happen? When you obey the gospel. Your names are written in the book of life that says you've become a Christian. Now you should be rejoicing in that. What an event that has just taken place. Angels rejoice in heaven because you obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ here on this earth. You decided to trust in faith in God, in His Son, that I need to leave my old life and have faith in my new life where there are eternal options that keep me from Satan and keep me from hell. I don't know another way to put that. That's a choice that we make. There's either A or B. I'm either going to heaven or I'm going to hell. People don't realize that just because punishment's not immediate for sins in your lives, there's no deterrent. I don't see that. I didn't get struck by lightning because I did what I did. But it's marked in the books that you did what you did. And when you obey the gospel, all those past is erased, left in the water, and I start new. There's no better deal in the world than that I can be forgiven of everything that has gone on in my past. And that's something I need to rejoice about. I may not be given birth, but I have Christ. I've been reborn. And if you ever feel yourself like Sarah during those 25 years, pick up the book of Philippians. That's a great book to help lift your spirits about rejoicing in the Lord. James chapter 1 talks about patience and contentment and wisdom, nothing wavering. Let the brother of low degree rejoice is that he is exalted. Talk about that in Psalms 21 as well. The king shall joy in the strength, O Lord, in thy salvation, how greatly shall he rejoice. There's passages, when you read the book of Philippians, 11 passages talk about rejoicing. But it's only 120 passages long. So roughly 10% of the book of Philippians is reinforcing how we should be rejoicing in the Lord. A lot of strength in that book. All right, keep going. There we go. But now Sarah's still not content. In this chapter, we're talking about the birth of Isaac. And then 3 or 4 years go by, and then Abraham decides to have a feast for the weaning of Isaac from his mother. Usually, by tradition, that's at the age of 3 or 4. Now, Ishmael is 18 years old. The baby is 4. And he's being weaned from his mother. Abraham decides to throw a feast. So all in all, together, both Hagar and Sarah have been together 28 years. Because they came from Egypt. They were together, but they had 18 years with Ishmael because they've been together 10 years when Ishmael was born, when Sarah decided to give Hagar unto Abraham. So here's 18-year-old Ishmael watching a ceremony that's going on inside of this camp with Abraham and his family, celebrating the weaning of a 4-year-old. And then we have Ishmael's reaction. Verse 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which he had borne unto Abraham, mocking. And why would an 18-year-old mock a 4-year-old? But he did. And that same word, ironically, mocking, is laughter. The same reaction that Sarah had when she was told that she was going to be a mother at the age of 90. She laughed. She mocked. You can see the irony in this, that here's Ishmael doing the same thing to Sarah that Sarah did to God. Mocked him. Laughed at him. No different. The issues that Sarah and Hagar had go back a while. Hagar was given Sarai to be her handmaid from Egypt in chapter 16 for 10 years of service, Genesis 16, 1 through 8. Sarah has an idea that she later regrets. She wants to give Hagar unto Abraham to give him a child, taking matters in her own hands. Then Sarah holds it against Hagar. She deals with her and despises her. And she assumed Hagar despised her as well. She goes to Abraham and says, you have to deal with this. It was her decision, but it was Abraham's decision as well. She's making him go ahead and deal with it. Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar in chapter 16 and verse 6. She flees from Sarah. She runs away. Couldn't take her punishment. And then an angel comes to Hagar in the wilderness, reassures her of her promise that you also, your child Ishmael, will be a great nation. Reassures her. She returns. Angel intercedes and return and submit, and I promise to give you to her by this angel. But now, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. You ever heard that frame? Mocking a 4-year-old in Hagar and Sarah's eyes was hideous. She wanted this woman out. She doesn't call her Hagar. She calls her this bondwoman. Get her out of my sight. Makes Abraham do it. That word cast out means to deport or to divorce from. It's a separation. I don't want any more parts of her. This is it. I'm done with this woman. Get her and her son away from me. 18 years that she probably thought Hagar was flaunting her son Ishmael in front of her. Difficult family situation. She thought that you're not taking my son Isaac's inheritance. You're not a part of the promise. Get her out. So this grieves Abraham. Two different reactions. Abraham loved Ishmael. That was his son. He grew him up. 14 years together, bonding as father and sons do. What a difficult situation that he has in. He may not have cared as much about Hagar if she was alone, a bondwoman, came from Egypt. She has an opportunity to go home. But now he has a son involved in this. Complicates things. So he's thinking that, oh, what am I going to do? I need this woman out of here. Sarah is I guess you could say, unconsolable. Sarah is filled with jealousy and bitterness, while Abraham filled with love, and he grieves. When you look at Genesis chapter 21, verse 12, and God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous to thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman, and all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac thy seed, in thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. Isaac will be a great nation. Ishmael will be a great nation. All of Abraham's children will be a great nation. And if you go back and see the lineage, you usually see the names of their children from all of his different wives over time. After Sarah goes, they'll become ites, Midianites, Ishmaelites. They're all a part of that process that later on that you see that plagued Israel for decades, centuries, that become a thorn in the side of their nation. But then look at chapter 21 and verse 14. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulders and the son, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. She was told to leave. The provisions that Abraham gave her was bread and water. Now, I don't know if you've ever been cast out of anywhere. Do you think being in that nation, in that climate, in that part of the country, the wildernesses and the thought about bread and water for two people to survive on? I don't know how much bread, how much water it was given, but where do you think that comfort level of Hagar had? And knowing that her son Ishmael needed to survive on these provisions given to him by, did Abraham have faith in God would take care of him because of reinforcing, making him a great nation? Maybe that's why. But he offered provisions for them to go. I'm curious to see if Hagar was feeling the same kind of trust that Abraham had when she was leaving his camp with some bread and some water, being deported. 18 years since the angel made the promise in Genesis 16. I don't know if she's heard another word from another angel reassuring her of this. Maybe her faith is stronger than Abraham's. knowing that, or is equivalent to Abraham's, knowing that I have to leave. God made a promise to me. He made that promise years ago when she was born. I've seen God's work in the life of Abraham and Sarah. I trust him. I'll leave. I'll take your bread and water. But then the provisions run out. Chapter 17, and God heard the voice of a lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of the heaven and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard thy voice of the lad where he is. She had stuck him under a bush, so she walked away, and she called it a bow's length away. That's probably 300 yards. You can pull bow back, shoot an arrow in the sky, it drops out. It's an interesting analogy. Rise up, the lad, hold him in thine hand, and I will make him a great nation. And the God opened her eyes, and she saw the well of water. And she went and filled the bottle with water and gave it to the lad to drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. The provisions. When she thought things were bad, God heard the cries of Ishmael and then remedied the situation. God, an angel, provides a solution. Grieving Abraham, God comforts him. Hagar's provisions, the angel reassures Hagar about her promises in Genesis 16. And now I was kind of interested in what happened to each one of them. You have Hagar being cast out. Don't hear from her from that point on, but now you have Ishmael. Where did Ishmael go? What happened to his life? And when you look at Ishmael, when you look at the information that I have available in the books, he spent 14 years as Abraham's only child. He had to grow up hearing about Isaac is coming, and if he believes in this, he's going to be replaced. He's despised by his stepmother, but he's loved by Abraham, and he's loved by God, and he's loved by his mother. He knows about the promises. What must he do? What must be going on in this young man's head? Being 18 and troubled, being in a family situation that's tumultuous because of the conditions that are out there. He returns to Egypt as an archer, and he found a wife in Genesis 21:21. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Syrian, and his mother took him a wife out of the land. And his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So he returns to Egypt as a bowman with his mother. She finds him a wife. And then the prophecies about about Ishmael is in Genesis 25, verses 12 through 18, that he will be a father of 12 princes. In 1 Chronicles 1, 29 through 31, they are 12 documented princesses that are in the book, in the Bible, that come from Ishmael. He participated in Abraham's burial when Abraham was 175 years old. So if you looked at Ishmael, how old was he? 44 years later. So you can see that he was not an old man. And the words using fell here in the Bible talks about, it wasn't like, you know how the Bible uses the word sleep? When you fall asleep in the Lord, you're in good conditions. Fell meaning here that he was not appreciated, or probably more rambunctious. He was a wild man. It was going to be predicted and prophesied that he was going to be a wild man. So meaning fell, meaning he could have been overthrown by either his family or his enemies. 44 years later at 137. You can see that in Genesis 25:18. But his descendants, this is now 4 generations removed when this event happened. So after 4 generations, if Ishmael's country or Ishmael's descendants were as fruitful as he was, in 4 generations, you can have anywhere between 12 to 15,000 people in 80 some years that came out of Ishmael that quickly. This is an interesting thought that when, I'm going to see if I get the names right. You have Isaac, you have Jacob, you have Joseph. And then when his brother's jealousy, Jacob had 12 sons. And one of them was Joseph. And the brothers were so jealous of Joseph, they threw him in this well and they were going to kill him. And who comes by to save him, to buy him? Were the Ishmaelites. God's providential care for Joseph and Jacob. Seeing the Ishmaelites, even the Midianites are mentioned. They are also descended. Hated by your own family, but then saved by your own family. The providential care of Jesus to make sure that the line of Christ, the strength of a nation, would be safe in Egypt for over 400 years. Building them up to be a great civilization to the point that the Pharaoh comes back and says, they're too big. I'm starting to be concerned about this. And they start removing their children from them. Ishmael becomes no more after that. Don't know what happened to the tribes of Ishmaelites. They are just blended now into history. But Isaac's names live on. When you talk about Isaac and the significance of his character, he lived to be 180 years old. And then the Bible describes him as obedient, peaceful, thoughtful, prayerful, man of faith, modeled as a child of promise in Galatians, an ancestor of Christ and a patriarch of Israel. Those are excellent qualities to be 180 years old. No fluffiness, there's no variations. God thought Isaac, you hardly hear anything about him. He's like a stone between two others. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac's life, not much documented, not much like Abraham's, not much like what I see with Jacob's. Abraham lived, you could say, a quiet, peaceful, and faithful life. And that's all I'm asking. That's what I want. That's what my faithful resume needs to be. I don't need to be talked about. I just needed to make sure that I am keeping my focus to the point that I can meet all of these qualities in all of my years of existence. So far, there's 60 of them. Am I obedient? Am I peaceful, thoughtful, prayerful? Am I a man of faith? That's a model that I should be looking at too, because even though Isaac's documented history is short, I have references here that I don't have to be named in the Bible over 200, 400 times to be considered a faithful man of God. The word's done. God sees who I am. God recognizes my works here, even seen and unseen. He does that with all of us too. We are all being written in a book. And that's what I always try to keep in my mind, that everything that I say and do is being recorded. It's going to be played either as an avocation for me, or it's going to be to my detriment. But I always want it to be support for things to help me get into heaven. I want to be called obedient. I want to be having these characteristics, more than anything. And the best way to do that is to remain faithful in God, true to his promises that he has given to all of us. Because when you look at this, we talk about characters in the Bible all of the time. Isaac's probably the one that's least mentioned, but he's also, I hope I don't go into Travis's lesson, but he's talking about being a willing participant on an altar to be sacrificed by his father, full well knowing that he could have been killed. And he was compliant in that because it was faith that brought him to that. Sometimes faith leads us to situations that are not comfortable. We have to be able to overcome it, knowing that God has a plan for all of that. You see how God is taking care of all of his people in his Bible, even though we may not see it. Do you think Joseph being in the bottom of that well, oh, Ishmaelites, I know you, you're my family? No, that's 4 generations ago. And probably don't talk about the Ishmaelites anymore at the dinner table. So this was removed from him, but God's plan had it. God's plan made sure that Ishmael was being taken care of through his promise of being a great nation, strong enough to lift Jacob out of that well to get him to Egypt safely. And then I have this allegory. You can read about this in Galatians chapter 4, about the allegory that we have between Hagar and Sarah. You got, well, on one side, on the Hagar side, you have Ishmael and Hagar, a child of slavery, and their descendants. And then Jerusalem is slavery, an old covenant, self-effort. Then on the other side, you have Sarah, a free woman. You have their child Isaac, the child of promise, their descendants. And that descendants block on the right side, one of those little dots is me. I'm in that family tree because I'm the descendant and an heir of the promise because I obeyed the gospel. And that's what Galatians chapter 3 is talking about. I have made my choice. I went on the side of Sarah and followed after the descendants of Isaac and of Jacob and of Joseph and all the way down the line until we got Christ that came to this earth. And then when you obey that gospel, then you become heirs to Abraham's seed and you get your little name documented on that dot of that family tree. You're a new Jerusalem. You have your freedom of love in Christ. You got your new covenant. You have God's efforts are now behind you. You're supporting you. That's given this as an allegory. It's called like a metaphor. One represents life without Christ in slavery. The other is a life with Christ in freedom. That's Genesis 21. And I am out of time. I'm in overtime. And I appreciate your patience for me. And at this time, we'll be getting going to our worship service. If any questions or comments about what has been said today, please don't hesitate to ask. I'll be glad to help any way I can. Thank you for your time.